Hi, my name is Michael Andrew, and I'm about to give you a free tutorial on the Panasonic G95. First, we have to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, B&H Photo, for providing the camera and the lens used in this tutorial. B&H is my favorite place to buy camera gear because I know if I'm not happy, I can return it, no questions asked. I can get a refund, I can get an exchange. They have a new program now that lets you apply your tax towards your next purchase, so you can even save money. So for all of the gear that we're about to talk about, you will find links in the description below, and when you purchase through those links, it supports this channel. Thank you again to B&H Photo. This is going to be a long video. Check out the table of contents. Depending on your computer, if you go Command F or Control F, type in the topic that you're looking for. It will highlight that topic and give you the specific time code. We spend a lot of time putting that together to make it easy to navigate this tutorial. If you are a pure beginner or even an intermediate photographer, I have to give you a word of warning. This is not going to be enough to help you to take great images. This is a beginning tutorial on the camera, and there's a certain amount of knowledge in terms of the basics of photography that you will need to know in order to succeed throughout your career. It's going to be frustrating if you don't know these things. And I say this because I have an excellent digital photography crash course. Again, also supports my channel. This is how I make a living. And so if you want to cut to the chase and learn those basics, that would be a very wise investment. My friend Tony Northrup also has a great book, Stunning Digital Photography. Tony's book covers more intermediate and advanced topics, and I think it's a great resource. In the past, for other cameras, I also make advanced crash courses, which really teach you everything you want to know about the camera, from strobe to video shooting, all the different techniques for portrait and landscape, sports shooting. If you are interested in such a course, check out the link for that. Leave your name and your email address on my blog, and if there's enough of you that want that course, I will go ahead and put that into production. In any event, we have a tremendous amount of information to cover, so let's get started. This lesson is a quick overview of all the external buttons and ports. The first is the shutter button, which has two phases. The first is a halfway depression, and the second is a full depression, which will actually take the picture. It's very important to train your finger to feel where that first depression point is. It's very soft step down. You'll feel it immediately, and it's very important to train your finger to know the difference between the half depression and the full depression that will take the picture. Directly in front of the shutter button, we have the front dial. I like to call this the primary selector. You will notice that it rotates to the left and right. On the back far right of our camera, we have a rear control dial, which I also like to call the secondary selector for a very good reason I will show you later. The FN1 button can be customized for many different uses. We have the mode dial. This will allow us to determine how much help the camera will give us when shooting. And we also have the video record mode here. The power switch is located immediately to the right, and we will need to turn this on every time we want to shoot. Just behind the front dial, we have three small buttons. The buttons are going left to right, white balance, ISO. You will notice that the ISO button is dimpled to give you a tactile reference when looking through the viewfinder. In exposure compensation. Below it, we have our video record button. Anytime you want to start recording, you're going to have to press this. On the front of the camera is the lens release, which we must press every time we want to take a lens off. On the inside of the grip, we have an autofocus assist lamp. On the top left of the camera, we have our release modes, and this is what the camera does after we push the shutter button down all the way, whether it's a single shot or a rapid burst, or maybe even a timer. The LVF button is the monitor viewfinder button, which allows us to determine whether the camera is displaying through the EVF or the back monitor, or automatically switching when we look into the EVF. We have the diopter adjustment, very handy if you wear corrective eyewear. One button that's very easy to miss is our force flash button. It is on the top left side of where our flash is. You're going to push this every time you want your flash to fire. It's not a very powerful flash, but if you have nothing else, it can save you. We have the auto focus mode lever. And I'll be talking about this in great detail in different lessons. On the inside of this dial, we have the auto focus and the auto exposure lock buttons. We have the playback button, which will display images after we take them. Below, we have a large wheel. This is the control dial, and there are actually several controls built in here. In the center, we have the Menu and Set button, which allows us to enter the deep menu, and it also acts as an enter button on a computer when selecting menu items. This control dial also has a rotating wheel and a directional pad which can be used and customized in a number of different ways. FN2 covers the quick menu, or the menu that you are going to see while you are shooting. It allows us to change some shooting options when using the touch monitor. And the garbage can button will allow us to delete images. Toggling the display button will control how different sets of information are being displayed. Under the right grip, we have our memory card slot. On the far left side of the camera, under the gaskets, we have our remote terminal, microphone and headphone jack, USB terminal for data and charging, and an HDMI port. Beneath the camera, we have the battery slot and our battery grip pin connector. So that's an overview of the camera. We've gone over all the buttons and have briefly covered what they do. I promise that if you practice, the day will come that you will feel you have complete control over your camera, and it feels really good to know how to do everything. There may come a time when you forget which button does what. Just come on back and we'll go over it again. For the rest of this video, we will go through most of these settings individually so you know what they are and what they do. Before we get into the basic lessons on the G95, I wanted to show you a couple cool things when we're first getting set up. It comes with a lens cap. You're going to push and rotate every time you want to remove a lens. And underneath this, you're going to see a red dot. The compatible Micro Four Third lens will have a red dot or something equivalent. That means you want to line this up. Something I want to point out real quick is underneath the cap of every lens, if you flip it around, it'll tell you the filter size. So this is a 58 millimeter filter thread, and that is referring to the front of the lens. It's going to help us put different kinds of filters and whatnot onto our lenses. Let's get the lens on there, red dot to red dot, and I'm going to rotate until I hear it click. Panasonic makes a lot of great lenses, and Olympus also makes a lot of great lenses. I'm actually shooting this video. This lens right here is an Olympus 12 to 42.8. It's one of my most favorite Micro Four Third lenses, and I'm shooting on a G85. The G95 is really a baby G85. It's lighter, it's smaller, it doesn't shoot as many frames per second, it doesn't have as much deep of buffer, it doesn't do as fast high frame rate, but other than that, it's pretty much a baby G85, and the G85 is amazing. I'm very happy with it. So that's how you put a lens on there. One question I get a lot is the multiplication factor of Micro Four Third lenses. It's 2x times the focal length. So this is a 12 to 60 lens. It is going to behave like a 24 to 120 on a full frame camera. Let's talk about the battery and the memory card real quick. We have our cover on the bottom of the camera, and any good camera design will allow you to open it while it's on a tripod. So this is a great sign. There's some cameras that won't let you do that. To remove the battery, we're going to flip the switch, the white switch, towards us. And if we look at the pins, they are facing towards the lens. So if you remember that, pins towards the lens, it's going to go right in until it clicks. We are good to go, and we're going to shut it. When it's time to put our memory card in, we're going to push back on the memory card door. It's going to pop open. And I love the SanDisk Extremes. This is an Extreme Pro. It's a 95 megabyte per second card, 64 gigabytes. I've had this card for 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years, and it's been great. Pins again towards the lens. Push it down until you hear a click. Shut the door. Remember, this is the only memory card. There's no backup, and this is another difference between the G95 and the G85 is that we have a single memory card slot. Still, I haven't had a memory card problem for probably 7 years. It just doesn't happen that much now. I think it's a really good idea to put a screen protector on your LCD monitor. This is probably one of the more vulnerable parts of the camera. You're going to be touching a lot, sometimes car keys or whatever. You can get them on Amazon. Put the cover on, and it's going to increase the resale value at some point down the road. You're going to sell it maybe 3 or 4 years from now. Those covers, if you have a clean screen underneath it, it's going to add $50 at least to the camera's value. So it's a good trade-off, I think. Anyway, Turn the camera on. It's going to ask you to set up the language. Obviously, hopefully it's English. It's going to ask you to set the clock. This is fine. And we'll come down to set. So the clock's been set. I'm going to say OK. Wants you to select your area. There we go. And we come to our shooting screen. Before we get into the basics of shooting and exposure control, it's always been easier for me to cover some of the information that you're going to see on your back monitor. The back monitor is touch sensitive. It is wonderful for navigating through your menus. You can do it very quickly, as I'll demonstrate. I like using the dedicated controls for the exposure settings, but there are some things that are a lot easier to do on the monitor itself. Let's go through some of these symbols so you know what they are and what they mean. In the top left-hand corner, this red symbol, M, that's your shooting mode. It's essentially giving the camera certain kinds of permission when we're on shutter priority, aperture priority, or program mode. Those are the four main ones. We have something called the dummy mode. I'll talk about it in just a second. But the mode dial determines how the camera works with you, how much it helps you, and how much work you need to do. This little guy here, the picture profiles or the picture styles, those are sets of instructions. Think of them as recipes in terms of how the camera is going to bake JPEGs. What information is going to be saved, what information is going to be thrown away. This is our flash mode. This is our video shooting resolution and frame rate. This is our shooting aspect, and we can see the little L there. It's how much in terms of the file size, the size it's actually going to be. This is our compression setting. We have our autofocus mode. We're talking about that. We have our autofocus clustered. We have our image stabilization. We have the battery life indicator. We have these tabs on the side. Some of these can be customized. We can add some customized things. Some of these are great. Some of these are probably a little confusing for beginners, I think. Come back to those when we cover some of the menu items. We have the number of shots remaining with the particular compression and file size type that we're using. So I can shoot 5,727 images with the JPEG setting that I have on here. We have our white balance. We have our exposure compensation meter, and we have our metering mode, which measures light. Something that you should be comfortable doing is pressing and toggling this display button right here in the bottom. So as you press this, you're going to notice you get different sets of information appearing and disappearing. Here's a complete blank screen, whereas the monitor is still working. So this could be very confusing if this is bumped and you have your monitor is blacked out. I get emails all the time, hey, my camera's broken. Try toggling your display button, and we're back to the original position. So let's talk about some of these other screens real quick. Obviously, if you don't want to see the settings, make it go away. We have an electronic level. You can see it's a little bit off, so I would come down and try to balance my camera until it's green. You'll notice that on the far sides, on the left and right, the green indicates the tilt side to side. And if I tilt the camera up and down, we can try to line that up to get green. And so now I know the camera is both balanced and flat. This screen right here, sometimes I refer to it as the quick screen or the black screen. Sometimes you'll hear me say. And this is a lot more intuitive when you're first getting started because it's going to allow you to touch the item that you want. You're going to notice we have this little return button right here, FN2. But we can touch these little guys and change those settings directly if we were confused or if we didn't know exactly which setting we wanted to have, things of that nature, white balance. I do think it's easier to use the dedicated controls, but this guy right here, your function wrench, this is going to allow us to customize certain buttons. In the beginning, I would say stick with what you have. As you become more experienced, if there's a feature that you want and you want to get quick access to it, come into the function wrench button and set up your custom buttons. Let's go through each of these real quick. This is your ISO setting. This is your exposure compensation. This is your flash exposure compensation. You'll notice the difference between these two is we have this little lightning bolt on the left of it. That's your flash icon. We'll be talking about exposure compensation later. We have our drive mode, which is what the camera does after we push a shutter button down all the way. For example, a timer, maybe a burst mode, things of that nature. Our focusing mode, we'll talk about what the differences are. Our focusing cluster, we have our compression, again, the aspect ratio and the size of the file. We have our Wi-Fi to initiate it. Hopefully we'll have time to cover that. We have our picture style, white balance. We have our, this is something I never use, the eye dynamic range. It's sort of like a contrast tweaker. If you're just getting started, put it on standard. It's going to adjust the contrast of your JPEGs just a little bit. We have our metering modes, and again, the total number of shots remaining. We can also choose to display, I don't know if you guys saw that, display the amount of hours for video. So you can come in and change that if you want to. Something I want to demonstrate real quick is that when we go to a video mode, so I'm rotating the mode dial to the video record icon, a few things happen. You're going to notice that we get this crop on the top and the bottom for video shooting, and some of the information changes. Not much, but we get, can you see what's different? This camera icon right here. So this camera icon, when we set it up correctly, it's going to allow us to change our aperture, our shutter speed, things of that nature by touching on the screen, because when you rotate these knobs, sometimes it'll rattle the camera. So that's something important to keep in mind. And we toggle through, we have most of the same screens again. Another important button you should be aware of is your LVF button. This is going to control whether or not your back monitor is displaying. You'll notice there's this little switch, this guy right here. That is an auto shut-off switch that when it is properly engaged, monitor, live viewfinder. Okay, so what it's saying is when that switch comes close to your face, you see it turn off? That is a battery power saving feature. So when you put it close to your eye, it turns off and it kicks on the small monitor in the viewfinder. You can kind of see that it's on. So again, be very aware of this and comfortable with it. If you're shooting on a gimbal, for example, and you have the control handle close, see how it turns it off, you would come and force the monitor on so nothing happens. Or if you're in a dark shooting situation and you just want to have this monitor on, you would have this set up. So those are your options. So just make yourself really aware of how these work. You'll notice that we have the back monitor on. Now we have the auto switch, right? Then we have the viewfinder monitor only. And then we're back to the monitor only. Very confusing if you hit this as a beginner and you're not really sure what you did. So let's talk about the mode dial. It's on the top of your viewfinder, just to the right of the viewfinder, right here. And as you rotate this, you're going to notice the letters changing in the top left-hand part of your monitor. So there are a couple modes on here that you should know about that I would recommend you never use them. And those are the artificial intelligence or the auto mode. You'll see it as a green mode on other cameras. I refer to this as the dummy mode. This mode essentially is going to do all the heavy lifting for you. It just basically turns your camera into a point and shoot camera. It's literally going to do just about everything. And you're going to feel tempted to want to use it. And I would still say do not use it. You've spent a lot of money on a great camera. Struggle a little bit in the beginning and you will enjoy the skill sets for the rest of your life. So the idea is this is a camera with training wheels when you have that selected. Then we have these artistic filters kind of things, and it kind of tells you what it's going to do. It gives you a little bit of a preview. You're going to see the scroll bar a lot in the deep menu. You can actually touch on that scroll bar and jump through the different pictures, or you can use the directional pad, which we have over here. It has the display switch. It's basically saying the same thing if you want to see it as a grid. Come in here and switch back and forth. But what this is doing is it's giving you a preview of these colorful filters and curves and things of that nature to change the look of the image, rough monochrome. And the idea is that you can add these different types of filters in camera. I think this is a dead end because most of these are gimmick, and you can also do them in post. You don't need to do them in the camera, but they are fun to play around with if you are bored on a Saturday. If you want to take a look at them, go ahead. Let's take a look at the scene modes. And I understand the scene mode feature. I get it. The scene modes were developed originally so somebody new to photography could basically pick what it is they're trying to accomplish, and the camera would dial in all the other settings. It's very convenient, right? So you can pick portrait or silky skin. It's going to add a filter. Okay, now we got hard backlight. All these different options, and sometimes there are some pretty good ones in here when you get into the HDR stuff. But again, the vast majority of this stuff is a dead end. Panorama could come in handy. That's probably one I would take a look at if you needed to do a panning shot and get a very, very wide shot. The rest of them is still training wheels. The camera's doing all the work for you, and it may not get it right. We have some ability to come in, and when we press the set button, it's going to tell us the different types of options and features we have available to us or kick us out, things of that nature. But again, I think this is mostly a dead end, and I don't recommend it. The next two modes you're going to see are C1 and C2. Those are your custom modes, and I'll show you how to set those up when we get into the deep menu. The custom modes essentially allow us to save our camera settings. So if we're always using the same types of settings, we can record them to the C1 and the C2 position, and the camera will remember it. The vast majority of your shooting should happen with the P mode, the A mode, or the M mode. The vast majority of it for still shooting. In all of my beginners, I tell them to start off on A, aperture priority mode, and I'm going to walk you through this as carefully as I can because I know how confusing it can be. For video shooting, there's one icon, but for me personally, I do 95, 98% of all my shooting on A or M. If you're really stressed out, at least start off on P because it's going to give you some control over this. Something that you should definitely make sure that you have on is your constant preview. This essentially is going to give us an exposure prediction as we change certain camera settings. For example, in manual mode, if I'm changing my shutter speed, you can see that it's getting brighter and darker. Same thing with video. You can see that it's getting brighter and darker. And this is a very powerful tool because it's going to tell you before you start recording, whether you're dialed in or not. The word exposure simply means brightness. So when I talk about exposure control, I am saying brightness control. Now there's a short explanation to this, and there's a long explanation to this, and I'm going to demonstrate both of them. The easiest way for me to teach this is to tell you, and if you don't have your camera, pause the video, go get your camera, come back, and I'm going to walk you through everything that'll get you started. So if you have your camera in your hand, we're going to rotate the mode dial to A. So it should say A right here. So here's the short answer. Find a wall or something you can take a picture of, push your shutter button halfway down, push it down all the way, and that you've taken a picture. Hopefully you've already done that by now. We have the play button right here, and we can play this picture back. Here it is. Now let's make the assumption that it is not bright enough. It's too dark of an image and we want to brighten it. On the top of our camera, just behind and to the right of our main control dial that we rotate with our finger, you're going to see a little box with a plus minus sign. It's going to look exactly like this, the bottom of the camera. We're going to push that and hold it down, and you're going to see that every time we push and hold that down, we get this really funky grid. Now, once that grid's up, we can use the rear control wheel. It's telling us which control to use. And I'm going to rotate it to the right. And you're going to notice the screen is getting brighter. Look at that. So once I've made it brighter, now I'm going to do the same thing. Take a picture, play it back. So this is the second picture, and this is the first picture. So with that one step, if that's all you come away from on this video, you are off to a fantastic start. You are on your way. If that's the only thing that you learned today on this video, how to change your image brightness. But we're going to take this a step further, and let's say that first image was too bright. So we're going to go in the opposite direction. It says -1, and we're going to do it again. And there we go. We have now demonstrated how to go from an even exposure to a brighter exposure, and now to a darker exposure. So that's the short answer. If you want to change the brightness of your images on PS or A, use this button up here, push it down, look for that grid. You can see these numbers here that have +1, +2, +3. Plus means brighter, negative means darker. And I'll explain what these numbers mean in a second. And that's all there is to it. So you now know how to use exposure compensation. So now that you know exposure compensation, my guess is you're probably wondering, how does it work? And something about this situation that we're shooting in is you can't really see our ISO. So I'm going to press my ISO button. And our ISO is set to automatic ISO. And what that means is the camera is going to determine how much of a boost the sensor gets in certain situations. So if it's a little bit dark, it's going to boost the light. Essentially the light comes and is captured by the sensor, and the camera will boost how bright. It's an electronic boost. And what I want you to do, for the sake of this example, let's assume you're in a dark, I'm going to guess you're in a dark room. So we'll say 1600 for the sake of this demonstration, because what I'm about to show you is really important. So take it off auto ISO, and something that you'll notice on aperture priority mode is that we only see the aperture, which is the size of the lens opening. That's what it's talking about. So the way we change the aperture in aperture priority mode is we're going to use our index finger. I call this the primary selector, number 1. Why? Because it's going to be right on our main dial up here. And as we rotate our main selector, you can see in yellow that the aperture is changing. Now, aperture is one of these concepts that you should definitely study up on. It's something I cover in my photography crash course, what aperture is, what all these numbers mean. Essentially, as that number gets larger, the opening on the lens gets smaller. And as that number gets smaller, the opening on the lens gets wider. It's letting in more light. Now, something you should be asking yourself is, if Michael is changing the size of that lens opening, if I'm changing the size from bigger to smaller and vice versa, how in the world does the image stay the same brightness? If he's letting in less light, should this not be getting darker? It should be. And this is the heart of the matter with aperture priority mode, is that we dial in the aperture and the camera decides the shutter speed. I'm going to prove it to you right now. For whatever reason, we have to tap the shutter button to see the shutter speed. Now watch this. Now I'm going to rotate the primary control wheel, and look what happens. The camera is making adjustments to the shutter speed. That's what's happening. So as we make the aperture smaller and smaller and smaller, what the camera is doing is using a longer and longer shutter speed. It's compensating for the smaller opening. It's letting in more light by time. If we go from a small aperture and we make it wider, what's happening is the camera is using a faster shutter speed. These are really fractions, 1/200th of a second, for example. And that's how aperture priority works. We dial in the aperture and the camera takes over on the shutter speed. Very important concept for aperture priority shooters, which you are now. And I want to demonstrate how this feature works, this grid. We're going to talk about, we're going to get into the deep answer now, the philosophy of use. If you can wrap your mind around this, you are going to be light years ahead of where I was when I got started. It took me probably a year and a half to figure this out, just playing with my kid. I just didn't know. We didn't have YouTube when I got started, So this is what's going on when we press the exposure compensation bar. What do these numbers mean? What do these little tick marks mean? I want you to take a look at the shutter speed to see what happens as we dial in to +1. You see that? 1/160th of a second. When I go to 1, it's now 1/80th of a second. What in the world is going on here? So what this means is every one of these numbers refers to one stop of light. One stop of light is an arbitrary unit to say twice the amount that it was before. So if I'm on 0 and I go to +1, it's one stop. I have doubled the amount of light coming into the camera. We can prove this mathematically because these are fractions. If you're good at math, this is 1/160th of a second. And as I come up to +1, it's now 1/80th of a second. 1/160th of a second plus 1/160th of a second is 2/160ths of a second. And if you round down, that's 1/80th of a second. So you can prove this. And my next question for you is, what do you think it'll be at +2? Do the math in your head. What's 1/80th plus 1/80th? That's 2/80ths. Okay, so if I round down, if you said 1/40th of a second, it's absolutely correct. And if you got this, you know that +3 is 20, +4 is 10, +5 is 1/5 of a second. So these are very long shutter speeds. Handheld, my recommendation is not slower than 1/60th of a second, or it's going to start getting blurry. So I got a hard question for you. If we go in the opposite direction and we're going one stop, what do you think this fraction over here is going to be? What's twice as fast as 1/60th of a second? If you said 1/320th of a second, you are absolutely correct. Try the next one. 1/640th, 1/1300, and so on and so faster and faster shutter speeds. And that is the heart of the matter with exposure compensation. So the quick overview of what I've just shown you, aperture priority, we dial on the aperture, the camera will dial on the shutter speed. Exposure compensation means that we can make the image brighter or darker by changing this little bar on the bottom. And the camera does this by adjusting the shutter speed for us automatically. We may not even see it when we're looking through the viewfinder and we're making these adjustments. What I recommend is just sneaking a peek on your shutter speed and making sure that this number is 60 or higher, 100 or 125, because if it's not on a tripod, you're going to be moving, your subject's going to be moving. If you got that concept, you are over the hard part. The vast majority of everything else I'm about to show you is fairly easy. But let me explain this to you when we're talking about shutter priority mode, which is a different mode. In shutter priority mode, we dial in the shutter speed. So now we're telling the camera, hey, this is the shutter speed that I want. And in return, you guessed it, the camera is going to change the aperture. See it changing? So if we come into exposure compensation and we bump it up, you can see it changing the aperture. You should be doing it by full stops, but the lens is not a wide aperture lens. It's okay. But I want to demonstrate, and you know what? I almost never use shutter priority mode. It's just easier to do it in aperture. I even shoot sports on aperture priority mode. I want to give you a scenario just for the sake of analysis. Let's say you're at your son's basketball game and you're indoors and you're shooting and you decide that you want, to capture the action. So we're going to go with a pretty fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second. He's a teenager, he runs pretty quick. If you dial this in, this is what's going to happen. You'll notice this red flash. As you push it halfway down, the camera is flashing red angry numbers. Camera is not happy, and this is how it expresses it. What the camera is saying, and it gives you a preview, is that if you dial this in and you're expecting an even exposure, this is what you're going to get. It's going to be underexposed. It's basically saying this is not going to work. So the question I have for you is, if you're in this situation and you have to have that 1/500th of a second, how is it possible to make the camera happy? Think about it for just a minute. If you said ISO control to bump this up, you are absolutely correct. Again, ISO is an electrical gain. It's like a boost that the image is getting after it's been captured. So we're boosting the signal. Let's turn this up. Let's turn it way up, 6400. And we push that shutter button halfway down again. Camera's happy. It's giving us a different aperture, 5.6. It's saying, hey, you could probably bump up your shutter speed if you wanted to. And this is one of the most important things about ISO control, is learning when to adjust your ISO. There is a penalty for it. I'm going to demonstrate this real quick. I'm going to exaggerate this on the blinds here. This is as high as it'll go in this mode, 25,600. I'm going to take a picture. And let's take a look at that picture. I'm pressing play, and I'm going to use my fingers to zoom in. And you'll notice how noisy. I'm looking at my blinds. It does not have all this grain and noise on it. They're clean, plain white blinds. So now what I'm going to do is turn my ISO down as far as it'll go, and I'm going to adjust the shutter speed even. Let's go down to 400. Camera's not going to be happy. So I just want to demonstrate the difference in ISO so you can see it. So this is at ISO 400. So you can see that the image noise is far cleaner than the image before. Way, way cleaner. And that is the heart of the matter with ISO. You can boost the light coming into the camera, you can give it an electronic boost, but it's going to come with a penalty of noise. But again, the summary on shutter priority mode is that you adjust the shutter speed, camera adjusts the aperture. Let's talk about program mode. Program mode is sort of like the dummy mode, only you're taking the training wheels off just a little bit. It's going to allow us to do things like change our ISO, change exposure compensation. We can change our white balance. We can, do things like select where we want to focus. It's great when you're first getting started. As a secret rule, a lot of people don't know this, program mode is typically the handheld flash mode. So if you were to get, that Godox flash and put it on here and you're shooting an event, I would tell you to put it on, I would shoot it on program mode because the camera will recognize that there's a flash and it'll make sure your camera settings aren't going to slower shutter speeds. That's the short answer on it. Program mode is curious because you'll notice both the aperture and the shutter speed are missing from the bottom of the camera. We can still access our exposure compensation, but we do not see our exposure settings until we tap the shutter button, and there they are. Now here's the thing that's funky with program mode, and I'm going to bump up our ISO a little bit, is when you change your exposure controls, it's going to give you some random settings. It just kind of matches, it changes both, but it matches them up. And that P in the left side there is telling you you've changed it. Program mode is great for pure beginners, flash, but outside of that, I never use it. Let's talk about manual mode. So a question that I often get is, how often am I shooting on aperture priority mode? My rule of thumb for aperture priority mode is if I'm short on time, I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. If I'm shooting sports or I'm short on time, aperture priority mode, probably 70% of the time I'm on aperture priority mode because I can control everything. And the reason is, as a wedding photographer, I would be shooting inside of a chapel, and then we'd be in the lobby, and then we'd be outside. Those are three different lighting conditions. And so as you're trying to move and navigate, and you're trying to take pictures, it's very difficult to worry about composition and not tripping and trying to change your shutter speed. So when time is short, I turn that over to the camera. If I'm shooting sports as well, is another time because you're outdoors, you have plenty of light, and sometimes you get clouds, you don't want to think about it, right? When I am in a situation where I'm shooting strobe units or have plenty of time, I'm always on manual mode, almost always. Why? Because I can get in, I can really dial my settings in exactly what I want. I'm not pressed for time. If I get it wrong, I can take another picture. In manual mode, we dial in both the aperture and the shutter speed. The camera is giving us no help whatsoever. Manual mode is enjoyable once you get it all worked out, but for beginners, again, start with aperture priority. Something else you're going to notice is that our exposure compensation bar on the bottom changes. Even when we press the exposure compensation button, nothing happens. This is essentially an exposure meter. It's telling us how bright or how dark, basically, our image is going to be. And it's giving us, again, in stops. So there's one stop, there's two stops, there's three stops, and every little tick mark in between is a third stop. So in manual mode, there is no exposure compensation, although there is a trick around that. And, it just depends on what you're doing. At some point, you will be a manual mode shooter. Now, there is a feature that we had on earlier called Auto ISO, that in certain indoor sporting situations, I think Auto ISO is quite helpful. So let's say you're shooting indoor MMA fighting, and you want a very specific aperture and a very specific shutter speed, and the lights might be too dark, or maybe they're bright lights, and now there's spotlights, and so the lights are constantly changing. What this does is it turns permission over to the camera to change the ISO accordingly. And once you do that, you now have access to exposure compensation. This is something that I'm kind of tentative to throw at you because it's kind of more of an advanced technique, but it's there when you're ready for it, is that manual mode can be turned in to exposure compensation when you have Auto ISO. When this is not on, you are responsible for all the exposure settings. So that is exposure control, how to change your shutter speed, how to change your aperture, how to change your ISO. We've talked about the different modes and what the camera is doing for us in each of those modes. We've talked about the short answer of changing our image brightness, and we've talked about the long answer, which is the philosophy of use of what the camera is doing behind the scenes in order to make it work. If you get this down, you are well on your way to becoming a great photographer and having complete control over your camera. The next part of this video I want to talk about real quick is white balance. I'm going to flip this back over to aperture priority mode. Now, white balance essentially gives the camera instructions in terms of what kind of light source we are shooting in. The human eye is amazing. It does very well when we go from indoors to outdoors. It makes adjustments that we will never, on a biological level, understand how amazing it is. Cameras don't work that well. And cameras see light sources differently in terms of temperature. Again, there's a short answer to this, and there's a longer answer to this. In the beginning, when you are first getting started, what I would recommend is choosing one of the auto white balances. There's general auto white balance, and there's the cooler and the warmer white balances. You can see it's almost no change according to what we're doing. Start off with that and shoot to the point until you notice something funky is going on with your pictures. Maybe they're going to be a little bit too blue, or maybe they're going to be a little bit too yellow. When you get to that point, then is the time to start looking at these other white balance temperatures. Take a look at what's happening to the screen as we go through these. The idea is that if you are shooting in the condition, you match it with the icon. So if you're outside on a bright sunny day, use the sun icon. If it's cloudy, use the cloud icon. If you're shooting in shade, use the shade icon. If you're shooting with tungsten lights indoor, use the light bulb icon. We have flash white balance, 3 or 4 custom white balances, which I'll show you how to set up, and we have Kelvin white balances. Something you'll notice is as I'm scrolling through each of these, we have the option to push down on our directional pad, and we can touch on our screen and adjust this. This is a shift that is allowing us to make it more green, magenta, blue, or amber. You can see the colors and how they mixed. And sometimes on Panasonic cameras, I'm shooting in here. I think it's a little warm sometimes. When I say warm, the look is kind of a more yellowish look. And even at even, to me, this looks a little bit more white. But if you're just beginning, don't worry about it. Seriously, it's not that important right now. Exposure and focusing are going to be a lot more important. As we scroll to the right, you see all of them have this option until we get to the custom white balance. Custom white balance essentially means that we tell the camera what white is, and it makes its calculations accordingly. So if I push up on the directional pad, it's going to say select white set. It's asking, put something white in here. It can be a wall, it can be these white blinds, it can be a bride's dress, something neutral. Press the set button, the camera records that, and it gives you a custom white balance. This is very powerful for mixed lighting conditions. If you are a videographer, for example, and you have a little bit of tungsten light and maybe fluorescent light mixed and you can't get it perfect, that's the time to custom white balance. The final one on here is Kelvin, which allows us to dial in a number setting on the scale of Kelvin, which is part of the longer answer about how all these color balances work. You can see we get these icons again, and you can see their Kelvin rating as we go up and down on the scale. On the very bottom, we have candles. Now, the way the scale works is it does the opposite of what the color of the light is. Candlelight is very yellow. And so what this does is it tells the camera to add blue to balance it out. That's what's happening. If we get up to tungsten light around 32 or 3400, it's still a pretty yellow light, so it's not as much blue. Sunlight or daylight, 5600 is considered the widest of the lights. It should be even. And as we go higher, this is going to be appearing on the monitor as more and more yellow, but the light source is like, anything over 7,000, 8,000, it's a very blue light source. The way I tell my students to remember this is that the lower numbers are cooler in terms of temperature, like a candle. Candle's not that hot. compared to a blowtorch. A blowtorch is very, very hot. It has a blue flame. And there's confusion in terms of the terminology, but that's when we're talking about the light sources. When we're talking about the appearance on the back of the monitor, if we saw something that was very, very yellow in the picture, we would say that's a warm image. And if we saw something that was very, very blue, we would say, oh, that's a cooler image. It feels a little bit cooler. But that doesn't have anything to do with light sources. So that's where people get confused, is there's the appearance of the image and there's the actual Kelvin temperature of the light source. So that's a little bit of the longer answer. There's more to it in terms of the testing and whatnot. But suffice it to say, if you start seeing weird things going on with the colors, it's going to be yellow or blue. In some cases, it may be a greenish or a purplish hue. It's your white balance. And if auto white balance can't do it, use one of the icons. And if that can't do it, use the custom white balance or the Kelvin. Something I want to point out real quick is that when you first get your camera, the way it's set up is that sometimes you're going to want to move your square around a little bit, and you're pushing on your directional pad, it won't let you do that. Come into your menu, page 2 out of 7, direct focus area. This is something I would recommend leaving on, and this is going to allow us to change the focusing square directly. If we need to tweak it, and you don't want to do that. We're going to talk about our camera's focusing systems. And in terms of difficulty and confusion and importance, this is probably the second most important thing that you can learn on this video, is telling where your camera to look and dial in the focus depending on what you're shooting. The philosophy of use on this is going to change depending on your subject. So it's going to be a little bit different if you're shooting a portrait versus sports versus video. Maybe macro is going to be a little different. Those are all, 4 different situations where you would have to know your camera in order to set it up. The easiest way for me to teach this to you is to talk about the how, the when, and the where. How, when, and where. If you can think about focusing in those 3 terms, this is going to be easy. So the first question is, how do we engage the camera's focusing system? Out of the box on most cameras, a halfway shutter button depression is going to activate it. You can hear a beep. We get this green dot pushing the shutter button down all the way. We'll take the picture. That's how you do it. Next, we're going to talk about the when the camera is focusing, whether it's a one-time focus or whether it's over and over and over again. Your focusing modes are found right here next to this thumb toggle switch, and this is how we change them. AFS stands for Auto Focus Single. And what that means is that when we push the shutter button halfway down and we keep it halfway down without pushing all the way, focus does not change. It's locked. This can be pretty handy when shooting portraits, things of that nature. And when you get a focus lock and move your camera, that is called recomposing. It can be very fast and very handy if you're trying to focus on something and you just want to take change the composition a little bit. That's the way to do it instead of trying to, move your focusing squares around, things of that nature. So if you're in the moment and you're shooting things, I do this a lot. Something you should become comfortable with. It's a little easier because we have a touch screen. We can touch anywhere we want and tell the camera where to focus. But sometimes, you got maybe a second to get the shot. You get a focus lock and recompose. Autofocus continuous means that the camera is going to be focusing over and over and over again. There is no focus lock. And as I push the shutter button halfway down on autofocus continue, we still get that beep, turn it off. But this is going to be better for moving athletes, people that are running around a little bit, like your kids playing, things of that nature, because what's going to be happening is the camera is going to be focusing over and over and over again, and it's not a one-time focus. It's difficult to recompose because the camera is going to be looking for an area of contrast. In this case, we have face detection on. I'll show you that in a second. And so that's the key difference between those 2 focusing modes. Autofocus single focuses once. Autofocus continuous repeats itself over and over again. The third focusing mode that we'll see here is manual focus, and I'll demonstrate some of this in just a second. We're going to come back to it. But we've already covered the how. We've also talked about the when. Now we're going to talk about the where. The where is the specific area we're telling the camera to focus in. And I also refer to these as the camera's focusing clusters. You'll notice this little square right here, right to the left of our directional pad on the back. How would you know that? If you're a peer, I mean, how would you even know what this is if you're a pure beginner? And this is why, it's so confusing to learn camera. There's all these symbols and stuff, right? So to access the camera's focusing clusters, we're going to push left on the directional pad. Now I have it set up on here so it's face and eye detection, and that's what you've been seeing. In the beginning, the two most important modes in here, in my opinion, are single square over here. They call it one area, in face detection. So let's talk about one area. And I'm going to tap the shutter button. Now you can see that we have this little focusing square, right? This is great because we can tap on different places in the viewfinder. We can also change the size of it by rotating our rear control wheel. So we can make it bigger or we can make it smaller. I usually shoot with a medium-sized box, just depending on what I'm doing. And this is by far probably the most intuitive, simple way to focus. This is a single square. You're telling the camera where you want it to focus and pretty much ignore everything else. Let's take a look at some of the other focusing clusters. Again, you can change the size of this, touch on the monitor, move it around. Coming into the clusters, there's a smaller area called pinpoint. This would be better for something like macro photography if you're really trying to get a very tight focus. And you can see, it's kind of hard to see, that it's giving us this magnification when I push the halfway shutter button down to give us this preview of how tight and how focused we are. We can obviously touch on the screen in different places. We can move it around within there. Probably going to be best when you're looking at very small, fine details. Face detection for portraits is amazing. So you can see that I put a picture of myself up here, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see what's happening. Is the face detection box is giving us a crosshair over my left eye. And that's basically saying where the camera is focusing. A couple of years ago even, we didn't have eye detection or face detection. It was a completely different system for shooting portraits. Now you can turn this on, get your halfway shutter button depression, you see it's jumping to my right eye, and take the picture. And it makes it really fast and easy to take portraits. Easier with one person versus multiple people. I get lots of emails asking, if you're doing a group photo, why are people blurry? How do I set the camera up to focus? Again, that's a depth of field question, which is covered in some of the basic courses that I teach on photography. So the gist of it is, when your aperture gets small, in terms of it's actually not so bad on this lens, but if you get down to a 2.8 or 1.4, your depth of field gets very, very shallow. If you're shooting a group photo, probably going to want to be around f7, f8. Just a little side note. I want to point out some of these other focusing modes that we have in here. So we also have a tracking mode. Demonstrate this real quick. Zoom out. Tracking allows us to tell the camera, hey, we're interested in this subject. It's going to be best for things that are not people. Let me flip this over to continuous. It's basically telling us right here that when we're ready to get a lock, push the shutter button halfway down, and it should track at that point. That's the idea of it. Now, I'm in, obviously, a controlled environment. I have a clean white background. The truth of the matter is, when you go to tracking, it's going to drop focus. Okay, it doesn't work as good as we want it to work, especially if you have a lot of moving people and cars, things of that nature. It's limited, so just taper your expectations a little bit in terms of how well you think it'll work. And then let's come in and talk about 49 area. 49 area is essentially, we're turning focusing permission over to the camera. It's good for beginners when you're first getting started, but it's basically saying focus on an area of contrast within the frame. It should work better on the things closest to you, like I have in this light stand. See how it's kind of picking it? I think there's some center preference here. It's kind of giving a little bit. But essentially, yeah, we're telling the camera to find something to focus on and it's going to do the rest. So not as much control, can't get as specific with it. And then we come into these custom multis. You'll notice that as we're moving over, all of a sudden we get this select and save. So when we come in here, we are able to determine different shapes of like horizontal. We have a vertical line. We have a central pattern, and we have our custom patterns too. I'll show you that in a second. So when we come in, we can change the size of these focusing squares. We can also change what part of the frame, if you wanted to focus linearly across the frame, I guess. Let's come back out. We can also select different vertical patterns by coming into the mode here. I'm just rotating this rear control thumb wheel, moving it to the left and right. If we wanted to set it, now we're shooting, you can kind of see that we get the highlight there. And touching directly onto the screen takes me back in to where I want to focus. We have a central pattern that if we come into this area, I'm pushing down on the directional pad. Again, we can change the size of this to determine exactly where it is. And then we come into the customs. Now, something that's interesting about each of these first three is that after you've selected one, you could push up and save that under a custom pattern. It's asking which one you want it to put it on. Let's just say we'll put it on 1. Overwrite settings, okay. And then we have saved these focusing squares to C1. Now, when you come into C1, this is pretty cool in that you can touch on the grid and choose very specific points. It's not going to guarantee it's going to be in focus, but the camera is going to be looking in those areas. It's going to depend on how far away your subjects are. This is probably a little bit too much, but it allows you to basically control exactly which focusing squares are going to be engaged. So once we've selected the squares we want to use, which this would be a ridiculous pattern, function 1 set, we're going to save that. It's only going to look in those areas for a subject, and that also saves it to your C1 slot. So if you want to choose something different, come back in. You can come back to any of these customs. I personally like this guy right here, single focusing square. Something you'll notice is that the pinpoint is grayed out simply because we're on autofocus continuous. Flip that back over to single, come back in, and now it's turned on. So we've talked about the how, we've talked about the when, and we've also talked about the where, which is the camera's focusing clusters. Now I want to talk about manual focus. Most lenses on other camera systems will have a lens switch that allows you to turn the lens from autofocus to manual. We don't have that on the kit lens, but this guy right here allows us to flip the camera over into a manual mode, and this tells us that the camera is not focusing at all. Now, if you noticed, when I flipped that over, it basically told us that we could double tap on the screen. How would you know that symbol is that's what it's telling? But in the manual focusing mode, if you double tap on the screen, you get a little picture-in-picture. It's going to zoom in on where you're tapping. I'm shooting on the G85 right now, recording off the back, and I use this all the time to make sure that, we're focused and things of that nature. So double tap. When you do that, it's going to tell you that your front control wheel will zoom in at 1/10 magnification, and your rear control wheel will jump at 1 full magnification. See how close we can get? And now what I'm going to do is start rotating my focus ring. It's the ring on the front of the lens until I get this nice tack sharp focus. Now you should be noticing something. It's very subtle. It's a little blue outline, and that is referred to as focus peaking. Let's see if I can show you a little bit better on my face over here. I'm using the directional pad to choose the area. And focus peaking is essentially an overlay. Very hard to see on camera. I can see it just a little bit in my pupils that will show you where the camera is focusing in. I think it's set to blue. There's a way we can change that. Oh, there it is. You can see it when you jump out. It's the highlighter on my hair. Let's come over here and look at. You can kind of faintly see it. So if we come into our menu, under the blue tab I, page 5, we have this setting here called peaking. This allows us to determine whether peaking is working or not. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing to the right. We can come down and determine the color. It's on blue. We can go to yellow, how intense it is. Coming back out, we can turn it on or off. It's on right now. But that is how you engage focusing peaking. I use it all. I leave it on because I think it's a great tool. See, it's a little bit yellow. And this technique of double tapping is the manual zoom focusing. So we're zooming in and then we're using our manual ring. Those are two pretty good core skill sets in terms of the beginning focusing. So one question that I get a lot is, what about video? When we're focusing for video, let's flip that over. What do you recommend? It depends. Typically, when you're doing high-end videography, storytelling, commercial work, you really have to determine where the camera is focusing at all times. And because of that, most of the time I'm shooting in manual if I'm doing something where I don't want the focus changing. There are other times where you might be doing an interview, let's say for a documentary, and the person might be moving around a little bit, and you do want the camera to help you. Well, we would come in to face detection and say, okay, camera, we just want you to continually focus on our subject. And there are other times where I may want to tell the camera when to focus, so I would come into a single area. So on autofocus continuous with a single square, the camera is slowly but surely jumping into the focus as we touch onto the position we want. This is called pulling focus. Even just a few years ago, you couldn't do this. Talking about 2014, you would have to get these gear rings, and you can still get them for manually focusing your lenses, but this is very nice if you're doing video work. So you can do manual focusing, you can do face tracking, you can touch on the square. So we've talked about lots of different focusing techniques. When we do an overview of the menu, I'm going to show you some of these features that we can tweak. There's a lot of them in here, and we'll cover that in the menu section when we go over it. Something I need to point out real quick is referred to as the quick menu. I haven't shown it to you yet because I wanted to show you the basics. We can access the quick menu, which will allow us to change each of these icons that we're seeing by pressing the FN2 button. You can see it's written right here, Q.Menu. So as I push that, here are the different icons on the bottom. I don't really recommend using it to change your shutter speed and aperture. Those direct controls are faster. Same with your ISO and exposure compensation. We can also come up and change, our picture profiles. This is handy to change the resolution of our video. If you wanted a quick way to change the size or the compression type of the files, you could. So AFF, the autofocus flexible, you'll see it written right here. I never use it. It essentially gives the camera some permission to change the focusing if your subject moves, a little bit when you would normally use autofocus single. So it doesn't really help, I don't think, so I never turn it on. But if you wanted to, this is where you would do it. And then we have our clusters again. The reason why I'm showing you the quick menu here is because we're going to talk about the metering modes. I have a little headlamp set up on my light stand. This is balancing there. And the metering modes essentially tell the camera how to measure light, when we're talking about exposure and things of that nature. So we can come down to our metering mode and select it. You can see there's 3 of them here. And the easiest way for me to teach this is to talk about the spot metering mode first. So I'm going to select the spot metering mode. So I'm going to flip the camera over to aperture priority. It's not going to work in manual mode because there's no metering. But in spot metering mode, we're basically telling the camera to measure light from our single focusing square. If I tap the shutter button, you can see that it's sampling light from here. It's recommending a 1/100th of a second shutter speed. When I scroll over the light, watch what happens. The camera recommends a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed. And as we continue to pan across in the sampling, the moment it gets outside of that box, now it's going back to these slower shutter speeds. So that's the heart of the matter with the metering mode, is we're telling the camera where to measure light from in terms of a shape or a pattern. So if I go with something like multimetering, which is going to look at the entire scene as an average, you'll notice that I'm panning left and right. It changes very little. It gives some emphasis to the middle a little bit, but for more or less, it stays pretty much in the same ballpark. If I come back in and I go to a center weighted, which gives a slightly higher priority to the mid center, you can see that it changes a little bit more aggressively. And that's what the metering modes do. It's probably a little bit more advanced. You know, if you're a pure beginner, I would just say leave it on multi-metering and don't worry about it. I wanted to talk about your drive mode dial. It's right up here next to the left of the viewfinder. It's this guy right here, this little knob. If you look down on it, you're going to notice it has some different squares and some different circles. And this is the drive mode dial, which is basically we're telling the camera what to do after we push the shutter button down all the way. A single square is a single image. That's what it's been on for a while. The multiple squares is for sports shooting, where you want multiple frames taken as long as you're holding the shutter button halfway down. Listen to this. About 9 frames per second. We have a 4K mode that I'll come back to in a second. We have our little focusing macro mode. I'm rotating past that to get to our time lapse, which is essentially going to allow us to program different intervals for the camera to take pictures at. And when we first rotated in that, it's telling us, too bad we can't jump into the menu. There it is. So if you see that little box there, right here, this is going to allow us to come into the settings and determine, you know, exactly the intervals, the number of shots you want to take. So I'm going to select that. And this is asking how many images do you want it to take? How much time do you want in between them? And you can do some time-lapse photography. So if we do the G95 crash course, if there's enough of you that really want that course, I will show you how to do the interval shooting, all that stuff. There's a lot of tons of great information and different skill sets that you can learn from that video. It just takes me several weeks to produce it, and I don't know how many students out there want the course. So if you want the course, put your name on the blog, and if we get enough people, we'll definitely do one and contact you when it's ready. But basically, it's asking when you want to start shooting. Do you want to set it to a different time? This is why it's important to set it up on your camera clock the right way. The idea is that it does a lot of the lifting for you if you are into time lapses for you. You don't have to buy an intervalometer. And on the very, very end, we have our timer. So if we want to change the type of timer, we come into the red menu. It's on page 4 out of 5, pushing to the right once it's highlighted, and we can choose 2 seconds, 10 seconds, or to take 3 images after 10 seconds. So that's how we can control our self timer. In the beginning, probably the most important drives are going to be your single frame, your multiple frame, in this mode, your timer, which is something you'll use for group photos and things of that nature. So we have 2 other kind of interesting modes in here. The first is the 4K mode. And the moment we come into this mode, you're going to notice it gives you this little E icon, which is referring to an electronic shutter. What the 4K photo mode is doing is that when it's creating a video, it's doing it with individual compressed frames. It's like you're taking JPEGs, 30 frames per second, to create a very short video clip. Now, this is going to allow us to export those individual frames. It's kind of a cool feature, but the truth of the matter is if you record video and you have a good laptop, you can still export frames. So sometimes, you know, it's limited in terms of what you can actually do with it, but I'm going to push the shutter button halfway down. You can hear that, fired a bunch of frames. You can see the banding of the LED lights in here. Can't see it right now. But when you use an electronic shutter, use a faster shutter speed and make this even more apparent. Let's just go to manual. Watch what happens. See that banding? So that is an artifact of using an electronic shutter as we start getting these bandings with certain LED lights. The LED lights are flickering, and so in the playback, you'll be like, what the heck happened? This is exactly, you know, the case with electronic shutters with LEDs. You can see it moving up and down. And the way you fix that is you change your shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. But let's come back into, we're going to play these, and we're going to come back to one that doesn't have it as bad. So this is our 4K play. Push up, and we come into this menu here. The idea is that you can touch on the bottom here, and you can scroll through the individual frames, find the frame that you want. You can push set, save this image, and it will export it. Probably one of those things that I would say don't worry about for now a whole lot. And we have some other features in here where we can turn on the peaking and see what was focusing. We can set this marker if we like this one here. We can play through them, see the marker there. A couple nice features, but I think your time is going to be better spent on things like, learning exposure or focusing and things of that nature. So let's take a look at the little flower and mountain icon. This is your post focusing. The idea is that we take a picture. Did you notice how the camera was kind of scanning and looking for things? And so the idea is that it's going to take multiple frames and stack them together. This is great when you're shooting macro, which is why it shows the flower. It's going to allow us to stack them together automatically, or we can tell it which range by touching on the monitor, depending on what we had in focus. And we say, hey, stack those together. I'm going to press the set button. Do you want to merge those points? And it will create a hybrid image, essentially giving you a very deep depth of field. So if you're doing macro photography, which has a very shallow depth of field, this would allow you to tell the camera to automatically take pictures at multiple points and then stack those images together so the whole thing's in focus. Pretty cool little feature if you get into macro photography. Before we jump into the menu system, I want to talk about video shooting real quick. Video shooting settings, in terms of the frame rate and things of that nature, we can use the quick menu to jump up to them here. If you're looking, we'll talk about these settings in a second, but if you're looking for 4K, it's right there. This is the one that you're going to want, 24 frames per second, 4K video, and you can see that the resolution changes how much time we could record or not. Let's talk about the resolutions real quick. So I almost always use MP4, and there's a few numbers in here that we need to pay attention to. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see it says 4K and then 30p. 30p refers to the number of frames per second. So shooting at 30 little images in 1 second. It's typical for video on YouTube. 24 frames per second is common for cinema. So if you're doing more cinematic storytelling, you'd use 24 frames per second, and we keep on going to the right. Then we get into 1080, which is standard high definition. So the number that you see here is referring to the number of pixels tall. It's kind of counterintuitive, but 1080 is 1080 pixels tall, 60 frames per second, 30 frames per second, and then we got 720. I'm almost always shooting my videos 30 frames per second, 4K. Something else I want to point out, just as a side note, there's so much information I can teach you about video shooting, is that you want your shutter speed to be about twice as much as your frames per second. So if I'm shooting video and I'm not in the manual mode, which I should be, I'll show you how to set this up. See how it's on P? When I'm shooting video, it's almost always on manual mode. That is going to allow us to dial in a specific shutter speed and aperture. So if I'm shooting 30 frames per second, I'm almost always at 1/60th of a second. Very important if you want to get that cinema-like look. So just some basic settings when you're ready to record. There's a red button up here, start and stop video recording. I'm gonna stop it. I would definitely recommend shooting a few seconds and importing it into your computer and playing around with the file a little bit. Just get comfortable with the basics of editing. White balance is going to be more important on video than it would be like a RAW file, because video is JPEG and it throws away a lot of the color information. So just make sure that your white balance is set correctly and you have your correct shutter speed, and you know how to use the focusing modes that we talked about. For the sake of time, we've got to start taking a look at the deep menu. Tons of information. When I teach this on a full course, this takes about an hour and a half to really go through everything in depth. So I'm going to try to give you a crash course on the menu right now. And to access your deep menu, obviously you're going to press the menu set button. When you come into the deep menu, you'll notice that we have the ability to scroll around. We can also just touch on the far left over here. We can select things by touching on them. We can jump out of it by pressing the F2 button. Come back in. But basically the directional pad is going to give you the individual menu control. Over on the far right, you can see that we can control the pages for each tab. So there's a tab and then there's pages within that tab. It tells you the total number of pages on the top right hand corner, in this case 4. And you can navigate by just touching on this slider bar over here. That's kind of the easiest way to navigate. It's nice that we can do this because there are some cameras that don't have touch control for their menu systems, and you literally have to do this to get to any place in the menu. So real quick, I wanted to go over what these different tabs mean. So these are our manual controls for video shooting. Then we have our basic controls. We'll talk about these and most of these in a second. We have our custom camera setup, and we have our camera settings. This deals with things like time and Wi-Fi, things of that nature. We have a My Menu setting, which is going to allow us to customize which features we use the most. And then we have our Playback menu, allowing us to access how we play back different images. The heart of the menu system is really this C wrench icon, because there's tons of pages in here. There's tons and tons, 7 pages on this one item right here. We'll come back to that in just a second. So let's talk about what all this stuff means. This is video shooting. It's asking us what exposure mode we want to be using. If you want to go to high speed frame rate, we could shoot up to 120 frames per second in standard HD. This is where you would select it. And if you play it back on a regular monitor, it's going to be 4 times the slow motion. I would demonstrate this on the crash course. This live cropping feature is something that I don't use. It's essentially allowing us to, when we're shooting in 4K, we can use a smaller view, like an HD view, and essentially pan around in the 4K. The reason why I don't recommend this here is it's just easier to record in 4K, and if you want to push and pan and zoom and post, it's way easier to do that. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for me to do it this way. Obviously, when we're talking about the recording format, I like MP4. I talked about this a little bit. I don't use AVC HD. Here are our resolutions. We've also already talked about this. The thing that I like here is it gives you the total width, which is almost 4,000 pixels wide. That's 4K. It's just a little short of that. It also shows us the data rate, which is megabits per second. There are 8 bits in 1 byte. So if you do the math, you're looking at about 12 megabytes per second. Make sure that you have a class U3 card if you're recording 4K video, otherwise the card might fail. And as we come down, you can see that the standard HD is far less in terms of the data that's being written. Snap movie I don't really use. We turn this to AFS, AFF. Again, this is something that I'm not really a huge fan of. I don't use it. The way continuous autofocus is supposed to work is that when this is turned on, the camera should be focusing continually over and over again, just by the fact that it's on. Sometimes this can be a pain in video because the camera is shifting and whatnot. So the idea is that you would turn this off, but what I'm seeing is it's not really working that great right now. So maybe there'll be a firmware update. So when it's turned on and I have AFC on and I have my single focusing square, I can come in a perfect world, it should be automatically jumping to it, but that's not the case. So maybe Panasonic will have something for us in terms of an update. Autofocus Custom allows us to change the sensitivity and the speed at which the camera focuses. So if we want it to speed up, we can come in here and tweak this. If you're a beginner, I wouldn't recommend doing this. The photo style can be confusing because it does apply to video as well. And essentially, these are sets of information that tell the computer in our camera how to create JPEGs, whether it's stills or video. When you come into this feature, we can scroll through a number of these different names. And it's you can't really see it because I don't have a lot of color in the picture right now, but it's giving us a preview of how that setting would change the look in the appearance. So Vlog, which is something we would talk about on the course. But the idea is that you choose one of these basic names and you can come in and tweak things like your contrast, your sharpness, noise reduction, saturation, in order to give it a different look. The truth of the matter is there's only a couple of these that I would recommend in the beginning to a beginner. I'd say leave it on standard, but vivid if you're going for landscape photography, natural if you're trying to capture what you see with your naked eye. Sometimes we see portraits, which is flesh tones, but really that's about it when you're first getting started. And as you become more advanced, you'll come in and you'll do things, you'll make a custom profile, things of that nature. The Cinema-like D and V are really great for video shooting. If you want to capture a wider, especially vlog, a wider dynamic range, and then you would grade that in post. It's a whole different discussion, long discussion. Filter settings I don't really use because I think they're kind of gimmicky. And then the luminance level, I would leave this at 16 to 255. There's a lot of discussion about what this is and what it can do for you. A lot of people want to come in here and do this. You don't need to. So the metering modes we've talked about, a lot of this stuff, for the sake of time, we're going to skip over. ISO, stabilizer is amazing, especially when we have it. I would recommend leaving this on. Don't mess with the electronic stabilization for video. It crops in, it degrades the image a little bit. Not a huge fan of it. We talk about a lot of those things on the crash course if we get there. Digital zoom I don't mess with. Teleconverter I don't mess with. Sound record display levels. This is pretty important. So when you come in here and we turn that on, it's going to allow us to see the audio signal coming into the camera. Definitely recommend getting an external microphone for better audio quality. And when you have this turned on and you come in here, you can see the levels for your audio. This is going to allow us to determine the sensitivity, whether it's too loud. If you see this get to the red and clip out, that's really bad. We don't want to do that. So we just want to keep an eye on our audio levels to make sure it's not too loud, it's not too toned down. Set that. It has a limiter turned on. So when we come back in, watch, see if I can clip this out easier. See how much easier that is to clip out. So the limiter prevents that from happening. Wind canceller, it's never really worked great for me. And I'd also recommend leaving your sound output to real time. This is where the meat is. There's a lot of information in here. Let's just jump through this as quick as we can. And I'm trying to pick the things that you should change. 1/3 increments are great. Extended ISO, if you want more ISO range, you can turn that on. Exposure compensation reset has to do with when you turn the camera off, does it reset it or not? This right here, auto focus lock, auto exposure lock, has to do with this button right here. So as a side note, if you are interested in back button focusing, this is where you would set it up. A lot of sports shooters like to use the back button to focus and whatnot. So the way to set this up, talking about back button focusing, we'd come in here and turn this to autofocus on, and we would turn off the halfway shutter button depression. So let me show you what this looks like in a regular shooting mode. So if you wanted to engage your focusing, you're pushing this right here. When I push the shutter button halfway down, there's no focusing. It gives us a preview of how many, with the burst we can get. If you turn off your halfway shutter button depression and you don't turn it back on, you're going to think your camera's broken. But some sports shooters prefer to focus this way, and that's how you set up back button focusing. I know I'd probably get a question about that. So in fact, I leave this just on AF on, and I'm just going to turn this back to on. We can set the camera to take a picture with a halfway shutter button depression. Quick autofocus I leave turned off. It tells the camera to begin focusing as you move focusing squares. Eye sensor autofocus basically engages focusing when you look through here. We can change some of our pinpoint focusing settings. So many details and information in here. Autofocus assist lamp, it's a little light that will kick on when it's dark. Direct focusing area, I think it's probably a good idea to turn this on. And what this is going to allow us to do is use the directional pad to fine tune moving the focusing square around. A little bit easier sometimes if you just want to fine tweak it versus doing that. Focus and release priority allow us to tell the camera to prioritize whether it needs to be in focus or to just take the picture. In sports shooting situations, sometimes this is worth coming into changing to release. It's basically asking the question, do you want to take the picture or do you want to make sure it's in focus before taking the picture? If you have it on focus, sometimes the camera will hesitate to, get it going. And in sport shooting, that's, you're shooting and it's like click, click, and you want it to click and it doesn't. And many times those pictures will come out great when you prioritize for release. So it's set on balance right now, but if you do some sport shooting and you want to tweak that, that's where you would. Focus switching for vertical versus horizontal means that was when we turn the camera in the vertical aspect up and down, is that it will remember the last focusing square you used and jump back to it. It's kind of cool. Loop movement is kind of a cool one to turn on. If we go to the edge, it'll jump over. Top to bottom should jump up. When that's turned off, you have to go all the way back the other way. Autofocus area display is on. I think it's a good idea. Autofocus plus manual focus. If we turn this on, what this means is once we get a focus lock, pushing and holding the shutter button halfway down, I can grab this manual ring and dial in manual focus. You can kind of see it changing a little bit. That's going to work really good with some other focus assist tools, such as this. Basically, when we are in manual focus, it jumps in. It's the focus assist tool. Let's get that guy over here. So if I'm in manual focus and I rotate the zoom ring or the focus ring, there it is. That's what we're getting for that. The assist display is asking, what do you want to do when you're punching in? Do you want that little picture-in-picture or do you want a full display? So when I turn this on, some people love this because it's way zoomed up, probably the better one out of the two. The function or the FN button set is asking, how do you want to customize your buttons when you're recording versus the playback? So when you come in here, you don't get a lot for playback, but this is the same as the little FN wrench icon where we can customize everything according to how we want. What do you want to display out of the white balance, ISO, and exposure compensation button? Do you want it to show after you press it or while you are pressing it? There's lots of customizations. The ISO control for, we push the ISO button. How do you want to change it? Tons of different ways, and this is in regards to the front dial and the rear dial. There's so many things in here, geez. Here is our quick menu that we can set up. When you come in here, there is the factory default for the preset. When this is turned on and we come out and press the Q.Menu button, we get this Q with a wrench icon right here, which means that when we press this, we can select and drag different menu items into the quick control. So if we wanted to, let's say, come through a page here, let's find something that we'd probably likely use, something like peeking on. I'm going to grab that and pull it down into the menu set, and I've added this to my quick menu. So now when I press my quick menu, there it is. There's my peeking. I'm about to run out of battery, so I have to recharge. But that is how you customize your quick menu. So moving forward, the dial set is how these front and rear control dials work, depending on which direction you want them to move, things of that nature. What gets locked when you're using the lock setting? I'm gonna have to kind of skim through a lot of this stuff. The video button does, the video record button, touch settings for the monitor, all in here. Obviously the touch screen is pretty useful. And then when you're looking through the viewfinder, you can also use the touchpad on the back to move the focusing squares around. That's what this refers to. And there's different positions of that. Auto review is the playback, monochrome. Just looking for the constant preview. You're going to want to leave this on. And by the way, when you press display on these menu items, you can get a little summary of what this is. So now we're going back into the menu. Constant preview definitely should be turned on. Live view boost, you can turn it on if you want. Just basically makes the screens brighter. You can read about which one does what. Peaking we've talked about. The histogram is this little display if you want to have it turn on. That's what it looks like. We have our guidelines and our center markers. Highlights, if we overexpose, we can get a blinking pattern. So if I were to come into manual and just really just blow this out. You get this flashing thing. It's actually a pretty good tool. We got our zebras. If you are shooting video, this can be very handy. And we can determine at what percentage those kick in when we come into the set. So if you wanted to kick in a little bit earlier, and these are the diagonal lines we get, the zebra pattern. It warns us that we're overexposing. So I'm going to turn that off. Our exposure meter guide, it's on the bottom of the screen, should be on there. Manual focusing guide, when we're using manual focus. We have our live view and monitor display sets. It's hardly any difference between these. Just, I think the default's pretty good. Monitor info display, definitely. I'm going to skim through here. A lot of these are kind of subtle nuances and things like that you're probably never going to use. We had our face recognition. If you want to teach the camera to remember a certain face, so if you have a child at a birthday party, you can come in. A lot of this stuff I would teach on the crash course. We'd go into pretty much everything on here. So that's a quick overview of the most important things in the C with the blue wrench. And then we come into some of the basic camera settings. So if you're looking for the manual, this will show you where it is in terms of the QR display or the URL if you want to download it. We have our custom set. So when those C1 and C2 markers on the top of our camera, if you want the camera to remember certain camera settings, you set up the camera the way you want it, and then you come in here and then you would designate C1. It's going to say, you're sure you want to do that? And you'd hit yes. So if you have one set of settings for sports and another set of settings for portrait, you could do that. And you could also come in here and add 2 more into the 2 position, just determining what it's set to in here. Our clock, obviously we set that up earlier. World time is your time zone. If you were traveling, you could come in and set this up. You'd basically say, yeah, I want to tell you when I'm leaving. And then you'd come in, set a return date, and you can also pick the location. So it basically is going to have the camera change your time zones and times automatically for you. Wi-Fi, I'm trying to hurry so we can get to that Wi-Fi lesson in the Bluetooth connectivity. There's a little connection lamp when you are connected by the app. It'll let you know. Audio signal, if you don't like the noise, you can come in here and always turn it off or make it louder. There's different sounds you can choose from. Volume, headphone volume. Economy has to do with more of the battery saving, sleep, automatic shut off. And then we have frames per second in terms of the playback. I have it on 60. I think it looks better. Our monitor display, I've turned the brightness down as much as I could so we can see what's going on. Monitor luminance, we can change the brightness of the letters. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's pretty bright already. I have it set to automatic. We have the eye sensor in terms of the sensitivity, this switch up here, how that works. We have our USB mode if you need to connect to a computer. We can power the camera with USB. This is in regards to HDMI. So if we're connecting to a television, you want it to notice the resolution automatically, or we can come in and select it ourselves. We have our language. Hopefully you're an English speaker. This video wouldn't make any sense if you were not. We have the firmware, which is the software that operates both the camera body and the lens. And almost always, every camera company, shortly after they release a camera, there is an update of some kind for little bugs and glitches. I think I found a couple already. And this allows the manufacturers to fix those problems. We can change the folders that we're shooting in by selecting a different folder. There was more than one in here. We can create a new folder. And we can also control, to a little bit of a degree, the file name setting. So come in here. If we wanted to change it, we could. I think it's limited to 3 letters in terms of the actual customization. We can reset the file that we're shooting on, so it would go to 0001. We could reset the whole camera, everything, if we wanted to. Nope, nope, nope. It's asking me all these questions, so if you want to reset those, we can reset our network settings. Pixel refresh has to do with when you get a dead pixel, you'll see it as a red or a white speck on every single one of your images, and this will allow us to reset it. Sensor cleaning. I have a YouTube video that I've posted that will show you how to clean your sensor. In the crash course, if we do one on the G95, I will specifically clean the G95, but the techniques and the processes are pretty much the same. We can adjust the level, which I would not recommend doing that. There's a demo mode, regulations. This one is super important. Format your memory card. It's going to be a clean and complete wipe of everything on your memory card. Make sure that you have 2 backups before you do this. So have your images on one computer somewhere and maybe on the cloud somewhere else, in trying to prevent file loss. And at that point, you would format your card. When I'm shooting and I come home from a shoot, the first thing I do is I put the memory card into the computer and I start downloading my images, and then I charge my battery. I'd always do those 2 steps right next to each other. Once the images are downloaded, I will take those images and I will copy them to an online storage or an external drive, or send them to my assistant. It just depends on what we're doing. But I do that almost immediately, because once I get past it, like a day, I tend to forget about it, and you can lose all your images if you only have 1 copy. You know, hard drives fail. So always make 2 copies immediately after every shoot, so you have them. If you're going to edit files and stuff, things of that nature, take a copy of those edited files and just upload them to the same folder. You'll save yourself a lot of headache and heartache developing a system where you're constantly backing up your images. So that, I know that's a quick overview of the menu system. There's a couple other things I want to show you real quick. The My Menu setting allows us to designate our favorite items, one of which for me is, I'm going to come up to the format because I use it so much. Format all the time. You know, it's something I'm always using. And just for the sake of demonstrating, we'll pick another one, I guess. Just something else. Peaking. Say save yes. And then we're going to come back out. And then, so we've added those 2 items to the purple tab, which means instead of needing to go through the whole menu, all I need to do is go to the purple tab and I can find the items that I use the most. So there's a couple other things in here that we can sort them, we can delete them. Display from My Menu, if you turn this on, what that means is every time you come into the menu, it's going to be the purple tab, and it's like a shortcut to get to it. We also have some playback options. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory. Slideshow, your playback mode, you know, what do you want to play? Pictures, videos only. We can protect the images. As a side note, if you protect an image, you can definitely format a memory card and it will erase it. You can rate your images, going 1 at a time or many at a time. There's a way to do the bulk saving for the 4K photo. We have some minor raw processing if you wanted to, you know, edit those pictures. So I would definitely recommend coming in and just checking out some of these playback options. So that's a quick overview of the deep menu system on the Panasonic G95, and I hope you enjoyed it. So let's talk about connecting to our smartphone. I'm using an iPhone 10. I would imagine it's going to be similar if you're using an Android phone. You're going to need to go and download the respective app from either the Google Play Store or the iPhone App Store. Panasonic Image App, this is what it looks like. It could change in the future. And once you have that downloaded, there's a number of steps that we have to go through to get this working. So the first thing we're going to do is set this up. We're going to come into Wi-Fi function. The setup gives us some additional features and options. We're going to hit new connection, and we're going to do the remote shooting. There's other things we can do on TV and playback, but let's just start off with this because I think it's the best one. What this is doing is it's turning our camera into a Wi-Fi hub. It has nothing to do with the Wi-Fi connection of your home. Think of the signal as coming from the camera, and it gives us the name of that Wi-Fi connection. I'm going to turn off my home Wi-Fi network and turn it on. And I'm looking for this guy. There it is. I'm going to connect with that. Now we could set this up with a password if we're trying to be careful. Come back to our app, launch it. They're going to communicate and talk with each other. I have this blue Wi-Fi light on top of the camera. Now there's a lot of information in here. By far, the most useful is the remote operation. I'm going to show it. There's a bunch of these other things I'll briefly talk about. We could turn it off if we wanted to. But when you hit remote operation, what this is going to do is allow us to take remote control of the camera as we see it. This tab right here is where you're going to find your F value, which is your aperture. You can also change your shutter speed when you're in the manual mode. You see how it's adjusting it? We can't really change it directly. So we can literally change, I'll flip this over to manual. We can literally change our camera settings from our smartphone. And I've done this before. I've put the camera in remote places. You know, if I was shooting an event and I couldn't reach it, I'd come in here and I'd just change the exposure settings and I could see the exposure. I could change where the camera is focusing. It wants me to come back out. We can change our white balance depending on what our white balance setting is. We can change the focusing clusters we're using. If I wanted to flip over to face detection, I could change my ISO. If I want to turn it down, turn it up, all while giving us a real-time preview. Now it's difficult to see, but we do have our certain shooting information mirrored on the top and on the bottom, number of shots remaining. And there's some other options in here that we have to be in certain modes in order for this to work. Touch autofocus, touch auto exposure. This guy here will turn it into a wide frame. So if you want to see the whole thing, it's going to rotate it and open it up. Come back out. The wide frame, I think, is kind of a little bit more intuitive because you can see we get the buttons here directly in our shutter speed and things of that nature. We can take a picture. We can record video directly. And I've done this as a remote. I can set up the camera, put it on face detection, change the exposure, and hit record. Stop recording. There is this feature that is jump snap. It basically will take the picture when you jump up, something to play around with. I've never seen it before. We have our quick menu. Now it doesn't have the custom quick menu, but it has the standard one where we can change the resolution and the file size, 4K, all that stuff. It's pretty nice. You'll notice that we have the ability here to focus. We can dial in our manual focus by using these arrows, and you can see in terms of the contrast in the shutters or in my blinds, you can see it getting more and more blurry. So this is changing the focus towards you, changing it away. We can continue to zoom in by tapping on this, get really close. When we're done, we could push the picture-in-picture button, or we could push the green guy, and it should kick us out. There it is. We have a reset button, obviously, and then we have a quick little menu on the side. It doesn't really give us a lot of, terms of use and things of that nature. We can come into, let's go back out to, this is a little confusing because typically when something isn't highlighted, it means that the feature is not there. And so it kind of looks like these features don't work. But if I wanted to come into playback, it's going to show me the pictures I've taken. And if I wanted to download one, I could select that picture and hit download, and it will download a smaller size file. I think it's 2 megapixels. Can't remember off the top of my head. We can rate them. We can delete them. We can come out to the main menu again, and we can come back to our home control. So the most valuable, in my opinion, is the remote control operation. That's something that I've actually used on my G85 many times. I will also use it on the G95. If you want to get directly into image transfer, you could come here. Now you're going to notice that we have a number of these other features turned off. Not a huge fan of the shutter remote control with Bluetooth, but it's pretty fast and easy. You'd have to turn Bluetooth on the camera and set it up that way. Geotagging will allow us to embed GPS data into our images. I don't use that feature on any camera that I've had this on the app because it drains the battery. But if you absolutely needed to do that, it can. And I think some of these other things like the snap movie and the photo collage where you can make these albums and things of that nature, never really use them. I do it on a big computer. So I'm going to show you something else on the camera real quick. If you come into FN, we have this Wi-Fi shortcut. I'm going to turn that off. We're going to close that. So once it's turned off, you're going to see that we have the ability to connect by Bluetooth. So if you want to see how to connect by Bluetooth, we would come to page 1 of 2 here. That we're going to pair. It's going to ask to hit the Bluetooth here. Enable camera to be registered. You got to select it. There's some user interface things here that are a little weird. How are you supposed to know to touch that? So once you're connected with Bluetooth, in any event, that is how we connect to Wi-Fi with our smartphones. Depending on which one you have, it should be a similar process for Android, and I hope you enjoyed it. When we're talking about lenses designed for the Micro Four Thirds system, a very important thing you need to know is that the focal length and the depth of field both need to be multiplied by a factor of 2. What does this mean? That means when you have a lens that's in the range of 12 millimeters to 60 millimeters, like the kit lens, this is an effective focal length range of 24 millimeters to 120 millimeters on a full frame camera. If we are shooting, for example, at f4, this would result in a depth of field of f8 on a full frame camera. So it's very important to keep this in mind, because your depth of field is going to be deeper according to the f-stop you have. I know for some of you that's going to be new. It's a very important thing to remember when you are choosing lenses. Now, there are a ton of different Micro Four Thirds lenses out there, and my recommendation is to find your general purpose workhorse in the beginning. It may be the kit lens that you bought it with. Both Panasonic and Olympus make excellent interchangeable Micro Four Thirds lenses. I did a review on the 12 to 35, both of them for Panasonic, as well as the Olympus 12 to 40. The workhorse lenses that I use are the Panasonic 12 to 35 2.8. That's the version 2. It has some image stabilization reasons why I use it. Plays nice with the dual image stabilization. And in this video, all of the back of the camera shots, I used the 12 to 40. That's an Olympus 2.8 lens. It's a very high quality lens. To me, it's sharper. I think anything in those ranges are going to be your workhorse. If you don't like the kit lens, if you're not getting enough sharpness, for example, take a look at those other lenses. In terms of your second lens, a lot of this is going to depend on what you're shooting. I really think most photographers should have something with a little bit more reach, something in the 35 to 100 millimeter range. Panasonic has some 2.8s that are great. I was very impressed with the Olympus 12 to 100, which is the equivalent of a 24 to 200, which is really amazing. That's an f4. But a lot of this is going to come down to budget, and there's a lot of overlapping focal length ranges. You may want something with even a little more reach, like a 100 to 400, again, equivalent of 200 to 800 millimeters. If I was to really push a wide aperture lens, if you wanted something in the 50 millimeter range, you're looking at the 25 millimeter 1.7. You can find them used for less than $100, but I don't want this to be too much about lenses. Find that workhorse lens and then start looking at lenses that you want for your specific type of shooting. If you don't already have one, you're definitely going to want to take a look at a tripod. Do not buy the tripods at Walmart that you see for $50 or $60. They're typically really flimsy and they're going to break after a few months. I have done a huge amount of research on this, trying to find the best value tripod on the market, and I believe I have found it. I have purchased a bunch of these on wholesale. If you guys want to get a good travel tripod in the $80 range, that link is in the description. I believe its quality is comparable to the Me Photo tripod, which typically costs over $120 or $130. I no longer recommend the Me Photo, believe it or not. And then we start getting into the Bogen Manfrottos. There are the aluminum ones, which run about $130 or $140. At some point, if you get really serious, I would recommend investing in a high quality pair of carbon fiber legs. They typically start at around $250, $300, the Bogen Manfrottos. And if you go that route, you're also going to want to get a good ball head. I like the 496 RC2. I've been using it for years. If you're curious about getting into landscape photography, I would definitely recommend getting a Coke and P filter kit from Amazon. The one I recommend is just under $30. It's going to come with all the adapter rings, which you'll need for your lenses, the filter holder, and it will even have some plastic filters, both full and grad. This will allow you to experiment with shooting landscapes. I talk about it on the full crash course. And if at some point you decide to get really serious about it and want a top of the line, high performance ND filter, you'll be thrilled to know I have developed my own line, and those links are also on the description and in my store. If you do any video shooting, you are going to want to invest in a quality microphone for your cold shoe mount. This is going to allow you to record quality audio. Rode has a number of really good, solid DSLR microphones. I've been using those for years. I'm using a lav mic, a Sennheiser E100. And if you decide to go with a flash unit, I like the Godox flash systems. You can get them for about $100, and I typically cover those on my crash courses as well. Now, if you've enjoyed this video and you like my teaching style but are still struggling with the basics of photography, check out my digital photography crash course. I will get you up to speed in no time. Tony Northrup's stunning digital photography is also outstanding. And if you want an advanced course on everything else about your camera, talking about video, portraits, landscape, strobe use, all that good stuff, leave your name in the comments on my blog and I will contact you as soon as it's ready. A huge shout out again to B&H Photo for providing the G95 and lens used in this tutorial. They've always been there to support me. So I got some affiliate links in the description below. Thank you guys for watching. I would love to earn your subscription and I will see you next time.